9 days since Australia had its say on the referendum, and I'll be honest, at the start of the second week after it, I wasn't expecting to talk about it, let alone talking about it at the start of the show. Of course, the result remains exactly the same as it was, despite the fact that the postal votes start to trickle in. 60.6% of people said no, none of the states voted yes. If it was an election, only 29 of 151 seats ended up voting yes. But I start today because a collection of Indigenous leaders have decided to sign a letter, well, anonymously, so I don't know how they sign an anonymous letter, but a significant number of people behind the start of the Yes campaign, not the wider Yes campaign that Australians had their judgment on, well, they have now reacted to what happened about a week ago, with Indigenous groups vowing to be heard. Put simply, they are now promising to create their own version of The Voice. It'll have the legal representation that, say, the Tent Embassy does out the front of the old Parliament House. It'll be as official as the Climate Council that was able to constitute itself with private money after it was removed under the Abbott government in 2013. But here we go. We accept that the majority of non-Indigenous voting Australians have rejected recognition in the Australian Constitution. We do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours. So we're now starting to move exactly where I said, towards the Aboriginal sovereignty movement and more of the Lydia Thorpe way of viewing things than the one that has been discussed of many months. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country that requires recognition, not the other way around. Our sovereignty has never been ceded. Now again, I can't tell you exactly who is behind all of this, apart from, supposedly, the core group at the heart of the Yes campaign that was defeated. Now, that core group, which does not represent everyone that was involved in the Yes camp, is clearly far more radical than they ever presented themselves to be in the past 18 months. And Australians, well, they could sniff it out. From everything that they saw Thomas Mayo saying through to, you name it, of people who believe that this would be some sort of a battering ram rather than some area of accountability. They continue. We want to talk with our people and our supporters about establishing, independent of the Constitution or legislation, an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander voice to take up the cause of justice for our people. So they're going to make up their own voice anyway. I repeat, it will not be recognised by the Parliament, it will not be funded by the Australian taxpayer, but will this group end up having far more of a say than the Australian people elected them not to have by rejecting the voice the best part of 9 days ago? Now, until we start to know who's formally behind this, then we can start to work out what happens next. But can you think of any other scenario? Let's imagine that there were a collection of people who voted against same-sex marriage, and this was a response to the majority of the country, soundly in every state, saying that same-sex marriage should be illegal. What would we say to the council of priests, imams, or anyone else who wanted to set up something in complete opposite to what the Australian people had voted for? Well, of course, you wouldn't cop it. But get ready for this one, because plenty of people have been around today, at least reacting in part to this key message, that despite the fact you voted against it, it looks like there's going to be an unofficial voice anyway, and it'll be far wilder than the one that was on the table just a couple of weeks ago.
I think you can understand that, particularly for First Nations leaders who've been fighting for this for well over a decade, that there's a lot of hurt and disappointment about the result of the referendum. We've accepted the result, and what we want to do now is work with Indigenous people and all Australians about how we can close the gap. We need to have some more bipartisanship on display.
What is the government's position on the statement?
You want me to tell you what our position is now?
Well, you can tell me you don't have a position yet if you like. The Prime Minister's indicated he'll be interested to hear from Indigenous leaders on their perspectives.
Can we go back to what they said? Because the statement is far more combative than anything that was said on referendum night, and definitely anything that was said in the lead-up to the referendum. They accepted the majority of voting Australians rejected it. We do not for one moment accept that this country is not ours. That's Lydia Thorpe talk. It is the legitimacy of the non-Indigenous occupation in this country, again, Lydia Thorpe talk, that requires recognition, not the other way around. So the question itself being posed. Now, whether these people were always on the progressive no, or they have moved from the compromise yes to the progressive no, our sovereignty has never been ceded. We want to talk to our people and our supporters about establishing an independent of the constitutional legislation. They're going to set up their own voice anyway. This is the Lydia Thorpe way of doing things. Meantime, an interesting play out of New South Wales as they start to discuss the treaty situation in Queensland, because both parties aren't going to say yes to it. It's off the table pretty much for the foreseeable future. In Victoria, they're pushing ahead anyway. And in New South Wales, the position is not now, but after the next state election. Now, Chris Minns did win that election quite handsomely. He will have a little bit of a backbench to burn. But interestingly, this is what he said about this move, where he will try to get an express mandate from the people, knowing up front that vote Minns in 2029 or whatever it is, it will actually be the opportunity to move forward with a treaty.
Haven't begun talks with First Nations people, primarily because they were so focused on on the voice referendum of 2 weeks ago, and that's been their focus and drive and direction. So we need to get around the table and talk to them. But I'm not announcing any changes to New South Wales in the face of the voice being defeated at the constitutional level 2 weeks ago. All I'm saying is that we've got to have progress and we've got to have meaningful dialogue. And I think a lot of people, even a lot of people that voted no, would suggest that that's a good thing. I can't promise progress in relation to this. I can only promise a start. And I'm not trying to be coy. The reason for that is some states have started this treaty process and it's gone on for years and years. And in New South Wales, we'd have to do over 150 different treaties because there's that many different nations.
Next state election's 2028. Yes, we're already talking about another election that far down the track, but he's a brave man because New South Wales made it very clear that they didn't like the idea that was being put on the table. Now, the far more radical, let's just start our own voice, is going to push this thing into a different place. 60% of New South Wales didn't vote for the recognition or the establishment of the voice. What do you reckon their position's going to be on treaty, let alone 150 of them? In part, here's what Warren Mundine had to say about a lot of things today.
I also saw the statement that came out overnight. It is a disgraceful attack on Australia and Australian people. And Albanese was captured by that group because he ploughed ahead at thinking that this was the right way to go. Well, it wasn't.
Meantime, another example of somebody who's telling you up front what their plan is, and normally you can ignore a Green from being able to win high office in the country, but the southeast of Queensland, and particularly the central part of Brisbane, is getting greener by the day. Multiple state seats, multiple federal seats mean there is a good chance that this bloke, Jonathan Shree, you may remember him, the one who said that they shouldn't have fighter jets during River Fire. He's had plenty of things to say. He is about as wild as the Greens can get. And he is saying that if he becomes the next Lord Mayor of Brisbane, he is the Greens candidate. And I repeat, state and federal seats show that there's an awful lot of Greens voters. This is a serious chance. He's saying that the Brisbane Council will end up paying the rent. Quote, I'm deeply concerned about how undemocratic our current council administration is. I think we need to rebuild democracy from the bottom up. I want to spread this idea of paying the rent through my campaign. I repeat, Brisbane is a place that changes, well, by the month because the number of people that, certainly during COVID, fled places like the inner parts of Sydney and Melbourne. It's on its way towards the 2032 Olympics, but the politics of inner Brisbane is getting greener by the year. They won plenty of state seats, plenty of federal seats. My expectation is that it'll get even greener in the next little while. So watch this space, whether the pay the rent guy ends up becoming the next Lord Mayor of Brisbane. Currently a Liberal, but the former member for Brisbane was a Liberal. They just jumped straight past Labor and went full green. Watch this space.